Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest newsletter. And my guest today is Annelle Sheline. Annelle is a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C. She previously served in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs, before resigning in March 2024 in protest over the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israeli military operations in Gaza. Annelle is a non-resident fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and I'm pleased to say a regular contributor to the Arab Digest podcast. Annelle, good to have you back.
Good to be back, Bill.
Now, I'm going to ask you, first of all, to what extent is the Iran war costing Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, the mighty MAGA movement, political capital? I ask because there are those who say, look at his victories in the primaries. His candidates have knocked off his critics. And of course, there's been that string of gerrymandering wins that would presumably tip more seats to the Republicans, those who back Trump. So is the damage to MAGA, being overplayed or underestimated or, somewhere in between?
I think there are several factors. In particular, you look at something like the fact that Massey was successfully primaried. This was the most expensive House primary in U.S. history. It was $32.6 million
Just
was
tell us
spent
who
on.
Massey, just tell us who Massey is for our listeners.
Oh, sorry. So Thomas Massey is a member of Congress from Kentucky who had been working very closely on several issues. In particular, he and Ro Khanna, so Massey is a Republican, Ro Khanna is a Democrat, and they both worked very closely on accountability for the Epstein files and really pushing to have those released. And for, thus far we've seen very little accountability for the absolutely horrifying information in the Epstein files. And so I think Trump and others saw Massey, in particular, the fact that he's a Republican and was willing to work across the aisle with Khanna, and in particular to go after something as explosive as the Epstein files, really saw that as very threatening. In addition, the Israel lobby was not at all happy with the ways that Massey was speaking out about this extremely foolish war the U.S. launched against Iran at Israel's urging. They didn't like Massey's criticism, and in particular, this idea that resonates with so many Americans, this question of how can the Trump administration claim that it is embracing a policy of America first when it seems very clearly that our foreign policy is Israel first. And so the fact that it required $32.6 million of spending on this primary to oust Massey, I don't think that signals that Massey has been defanged or that this perspective, is clearly weak. I think it shows just how frightened these political forces, in particular the Israel lobby, are. And I think of the fact that only a few short years ago, the Israel lobby really didn't have to spend much money at all and was able, an AIPAC endorsement was seen as a golden ticket or seen as certainly something very desirable for a member of Congress, whereas now it is very much seen, they have to hide the fact. AIPAC is having to hide its money behind other entities. It's become such a liability to be seen as associated with AIPAC. This entity that is extremely powerful inside American politics is having to hide its influence because it's become so radioactive to be associated with or seen as sort of supporting Israeli interests over American interests. So, and your point about the gerrymandering, this is extremely alarming. In particular, you think about like the fact that you had the referendum in Virginia, where a majority of Virginia voters, their will was overturned by the Virginia Supreme Court. They wanted to push back with the Republican gerrymandering, and again, gerrymandering shouldn't be allowed in either case, but when you have the Republicans doing it, it seems obvious that the Democrats should do it too, or just be prepared to roll over and let let the Republicans just dominate our political system forever. I think that you're seeing a lot of resonance in American politics with this this opposition to a foreign policy that is dictated by Israeli preferences, by the preferences of the Israeli government. And I think you're seeing a lot of Americans that are feeling betrayed. They felt that they voted for Trump because they didn't want any more stupid wars. And here we are with gas prices through the roof and inflation and spikes in the prices of commodities and food shortages around the world. I mean, it's truly mind-boggling to think back to where we were a year ago when Trump was making his first international tour or visit since returning to the White House, and he was visiting the Gulf countries and saying all these things that they were very happy to hear about how nation building was so stupid and the United States had been involved in a region it didn't understand and shouldn't do those kinds of things anymore. And yet, what a
Here
difference!
he is. Here he
Right,
is.
and yet here we are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you know, yeah, that point about, I suppose it's all kind of still up in the air trying to figure out the damage. But I think about the independents. I mean, the polls show that, the Trump support still seems pretty good. But if you look at the independents, they don't like what they're seeing with Donald Trump. They don't like the foreign adventures, the excursion, as he called it, in Iran. They don't like what the Israelis are doing and the genocide that's being committed. And there are resonances with people on well, in some cases, the far right who share the same view.
Exactly. I mean, this is what the Quincy Institute was founded on, which is even if you disagree with, on certain, I disagree fundamentally on basically everything that the right wing believes in. But if they agree on a less interventionist U.S. foreign policy, I am happy to work with them on those issues. And I think right now, what's interesting is you hear some folks on the left questioning when you hear people on the right, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tucker Carlson, and the ways that they are questioning U.S. support for Israel, and they're saying, you shouldn't trust that, or they've been bigoted in other ways, and we shouldn't ally with them. And I think this sort of purity test that you tend to hear from people on the left is weakening them and in many ways is serving the agenda of the very powerful interests allied in favor of US interventionism and in favor of the Israel lobby and the military industrial complex. And they'd be very pleased to see this coalition building between those who want less US military intervention, who want less money, less American money going to support Israel, don't want the US funding the murder of children in other countries, whether it's Iran or Lebanon or anywhere. They would love to see that kind of coalition fall apart. And so I think it's just so maddening when you have, people that I otherwise very much respect and appreciate their leadership, but their sort of unwillingness to work with people who they don't see completely eye to eye with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, the war unquestionably is widely unpopular on the right, on the left, and in the middle in America. So is the clock ticking, Annelle, on President Trump to extricate himself and indeed the country from this war?
The clock is ticking, and I think it's been instructive when Trump says things like he doesn't care about the financial situation of Americans. That really, I could imagine the strategists with an eye to the midterms are somewhat gobsmacked by statements like that
Yeah.
because you say this is extremely unpopular. But I do worry again that Democrats who otherwise think that all they have to do is demonstrate that they are opposed to Trump, that they think that will win votes when this is what we saw in the 2024 election. You just saw so many people who had voted for Biden, but who were not, who were completely horrified by what the US was enabling Israel to do in Gaza. And they heard Harris say that she wouldn't change anything about Biden's foreign policy, and they just stayed home in record
Yeah.
numbers.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
the massive turnout we saw to get Trump out of office in 2020, so many of those people just did not show up. And so I very much worry that when you have, for example, Schumer speaking at this ridiculous pro-Israel parade in New York.
The one that Mamdani didn't show up to.
Yeah, it's just like
Yeah.
what, like when you have like majorities of the American public are opposed to this blank check to Israel, even if they don't care about Palestinians, but they just don't want their money going to fund Israel. Why is the leadership of the Democratic Party continuing to throw its weight behind, in with this rogue genocidal state? I mean, I think the reason, we know the reason, it's our politics are corrupted by things like Citizens United and the politicians are in the pockets of the donor class, and it doesn't matter what ordinary Americans think. But I just worry that the lesson people will take away from this is like clearly Americans don't actually care about foreign policy, yada yada. And it's like, no, Americans do care about foreign policy and they do care about the money that the US is funneling to Israel. And it's just that the Democrats are not taking a strong enough stance on that. And
Yeah.
and it really is very much seen as an indicator of, are you willing to stand up to donors? Are you willing to acknowledge the reality of what we've all been seeing on our phones for the past 2.5 years, and to call out the forces that are enabling that?
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're right that voters are looking for clarity, and here's an opportunity to provide that clarity. Am I right in thinking that Smotrich, the finance Israeli finance minister, was at this
Yes,
pro-Israel?
he
Yeah,
was here. He should have been arrested the moment he stepped off the plane, and yet just marching through the streets of New York City.
this is a man who justifies genocide, who proudly said, "Yes, I'm a homophobe, I'm a fascist," who wants to drive Palestinians not just out of Gaza. He wants to drive him out of the West Bank. He wants to realize his dream of a greater Israel with his sidekick, the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, that infamous and awful man. But then I want to ask you this now, because we keep coming back to Israel. We have to circle around Israel. And here we have Benjamin Netanyahu, perhaps for just political reasons, perhaps he really believes it, but he's spoken often of his desire to create a new Middle East with Israel as its hegemon. And of course, he seized much of South Lebanon. He's indeed gone across the Litani River now. He's got a big chunk of southwestern Syria, more than half of Gaza. I think it's 60%. He's saying he wants 70% or maybe a little more. You've got the land seizures and the ethnic cleansing that is continuing in the West Bank and East Jerusalem day by day, with the IDF standing by and in some instances helping to drive Palestinians out of their homes and off their land. So isn't Benjamin Netanyahu achieving his goal?
Certainly, there has been almost no resistance from the United States. I think we are seeing there was a lot of hullabaloo about this notion that Trump was frustrated with Netanyahu, this Axios reporting from Barak Ravid. And to me, that just sounds very similar to what we heard coming out of the Biden administration, where there'd be these leaks that Biden was very frustrated with Netanyahu. And it's nonsense, because if either Biden or Trump actually wanted to influence Netanyahu, they would just need to say, we're not sending you any more money. We're not going to, your planes can't fly without us. The entire Israeli Air Force is American-made planes, and they can't fly without regular American maintenance, to say nothing of the billions and billions of dollars the US sends Israel every year. So this notion that Netanyahu could do any of this without the agreement of the Americans is nonsensical. And I just worry that when you have Netanyahu pursuing, the Israelis in general and Netanyahu specifically understand that US public opinion is turning against them. And this is part of why we have this effort in the current NDAA.
Just remind us, for folks outside of the US, NDAA stands for.
The National Defense Authorization Act, which is sort of the one big must-pass defense spending bill that goes through every year.
And there's a move in the administration to do what?
To shift from the MOU model, whereby every 10 years the US has re-upped our commitment to give billions of dollars to Israel every year, but it's through the State Department channels, it's through security assistance. and foreign military financing, and to try to move all of that into the Pentagon procurement process such that it would no longer be subject to things like the Leahy laws or just any sort of scrutiny or visibility or accountability. And again, to be clear, not that the US has ever actually applied the Leahy laws to Israel, but they technically should apply.
The Leahy
Um,
laws being that you don't sell weapons to bad guys who are committing human rights abuses.
well, not even you don't sell weapons, you don't give security assistance. The US just gives Israel money. It's not even that we're selling. I mean, the US does also sell things to Israel, but that the US just gives this money to Israel. That's where it's the Leahy laws come in. Like, so that's what security assistance is. It's this military aid. It's giving the money. And so, yes, moving it from that security assistance and the sort of military aid to a joint Pentagon procurement process. And what we're hearing and what's wild is you have Netanyahu saying things like, the Israel is no longer dependent on the US or shouldn't be, and then Laura Loomer's tweeting this stuff. I mean, we know that those who are motivated by maintaining the US Israel close relationship are trying to sort of do this sleight of hand where they say Israel doesn't need the US anymore, but really what they're trying to do is just move it into the Pentagon procurement process where it would be much more difficult to get visibility into it, much more difficult to stop it, because then it's contracts, and so then to end it, would be breaking contracts. This would be very expensive. It'd be very difficult. You'd have members of Congress who are invested in maintaining the military contracts because it supports X number of jobs in their districts. The same way the whole military industrial complex already works. And
Hmm.
to be clear, Israel is already a big part of this. This isn't new, but this would make it would sort of rechannel a lot of this money and much more of this money, more of Americans' money would then be going to support the Israeli military machine and to pursue Israel's goals of military hegemony in the Middle East. It just wouldn't be in a manner that is quite as easy to see or to oppose.
Yeah, transparency is not a mark of the Trump regime. In fact, they're dashing towards every opaque corner that can be found, you know. So it's yeah, but that's very interesting that maneuver as well. I wasn't aware that that was in the offing.
Just quickly, it's section 224 of the NDAA. We're trying to push to have it stripped out, because this is the provision, the amendment to the NDAA that is calling for this sort of defense integration. And they're arguing this will support U.S. jobs, it'll also support the lives of U.S. soldiers, and yet they've also acknowledged that there's a is this information is already like the you don't need an amendment to the NDAA to have the US and Israel share intelligence. Like, we already share massive amounts of intelligence with them. And instead what this really is trying to sort of integrate the US and Israeli militaries in ways that already there's the amount of espionage the Israeli military is already engaged in, or sort of intellectual property theft. It's wild how the US is already aware of needing to sort of protect ourselves from Israeli espionage, and yet now we want to sort of open up our entire military to Israel. And anyway, so if people are opposed to that, they should call their representatives and ask them to strip Section 224 from the NDAA or to support that effort.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Annelle Sheline, a Middle East analyst at Washington's Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Sign up, and you'll receive the first 2 months for free. That's arabdigest.org. I want to go to the Gulf now, and of course, we have Trump with his offhand remark to blow up Oman and his demand that more Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia, chief among them, sign on to the Abraham Accords. I'm just wondering now what is left of America's relationship with the Gulf states, and going forward, can the damage he has inflicted on that relationship be repaired, be restored?
I was just at the Omani embassy. They are reeling not only from that comment Trump made, but also then from this Wall Street Journal reporting about the idea that the Trump administration is pressuring Oman to choose a side and to stop sort of be acting as a mediator, which is crazy because when you're like you need mediators. Trump is we've had Pakistan acting as a mediator in the past. We've had Qatar, we've had Oman. It's unclear how Trump is expecting to wind down this conflict if there isn't someone to help negotiate an end to the conflict. So the Omanis are feeling alarmed. And as far as could the US relationships with the Gulf countries be repaired? I hope they are not repaired because I think Trump is not going to be the last president to engage in this manner. I mean, we saw this also under Biden, where you had the Biden administration insisting that countries pick a side, pick us or China. And when for the Gulf countries, who so much of their oil is China's their most important consumer, but their biggest customer, and China has engaged in all sorts of collaborative, like the Gulf economies and China's economy are very much bound up together, much more than the American economy and the Gulf economies. And so if you're asking these countries to pick a side, they may have to pick China, or they would just resist that pressure, and they would say, look, don't make us choose. And so moving forward, I mean, I hope we don't end up in a situation of uh, World War III, US versus China. But I very much fear that no matter who is going to occupy the White House next, that competition and rivalry with China is going to continue to be a major factor. And the whole world is going to be, the US is going to ask the whole world to choose. So all this to say, I hope that the whole world is rethinking its reliance on the United States, whether economically or from a security perspective, and just recognizing that the US, the American electorate re-elected Donald Trump after seeing what he did the first time. A majority of Americans this time, he won the popular vote, and don't put it past Americans to not do something like this again. It's so clear that the role of the United States as sort of the linchpin of the world order is not working. It's not serving America's interests. It's not serving the interests of the rest of the world. And the alternative that many countries have long advocated for is a more robust system of international law, is a more robust system of multilateralism, a stronger UN, a more effective UN. Obviously, there's a need for significant reform, such as at the UN Security Council, but those are all doable. Whereas the to continue to rely on the United States, no matter who's in charge, I think is really not in the long-term interests of the rest of the world, and I think also has not been in the interests of Americans.
Yeah, yeah, I don't think it has either. But there you go. I mean, Trump, he may not carry through on blowing up Oman. I certainly hope he doesn't, but he has, as you suggest, pretty much blown up his relationship with those Gulf states. Um, and then the other thing I just wanted to briefly comment on or get your thoughts on is that, Mark Carney, that now famous Davos speech, the Canadian Prime Minister, talked about the power of middle powers as an option to, the American model, if you will. And Carney saying, that's over, that's done. We've got to look for something new and we've got to look quickly.
Yes, well, and I think there's a reason people are still talking about that. He was, for all that he very quickly sort of abandoned that more principled stance he was taking, he was willing to say it out loud that, Canada and other countries have been willing to sort of turn a blind eye to America's abuses because they benefited from this American-led, American-dominated system. And again, I do just very much hope that countries are rethinking that. I don't expect to see very swift transitions right now. I think the Gulf states obviously are not interested in antagonizing Trump. They know he's mercurial, and as you said, we hope he doesn't actually follow through on blowing up Oman. We don't think he was serious about that, but who knows? He
Yeah,
does all
yeah.
kinds of crazy things. I I think that one thing that you've also heard a lot about is this idea of a return to sort of spheres of influence, and the fact that even FDR had been willing to think about, the US having its own sphere of influence, Russia and the Soviet Union sort of having its sphere, and that from an American perspective, the fact that FDR didn't survive long past World War II, and that Truman took over. And Truman was not interested in that. Truman did want to establish sort of this American hegemony, or to compete with the USSR for control of the world. And that led to so much violence. And so while I'm certainly not in favor of the so-called Dunroe Doctrine, where Donald Trump is just murdering fishermen in the Caribbean and the Pacific. I do think that there's a certain logic, to abandoning this notion that the U.S. that it's good for the rest of the world for America to dominate it in the name of human rights or whatever. Because I mean, obviously, when you look at the ledger of what actually American domination has meant, it has meant a lot of violence and not a foreign policy that is guided by human rights, as I observed up close and personally at the State Department. And
Yeah.
so this notion that, we can't let China or Russia dominate, I think it's like, well, what's you think it's working well for the United States to try to dominate East Asia? Like, do you really want to get into a nuclear war with China? I mean, that's what that looks like.
Mm.
This idea that the US can just maintain our unrivaled superpower status just isn't backed up by the geopolitical realities of China's power, of the variety of middle powers that are relatively much more influential than they were looking back to even the 90s. So I think when you hear people saying, no, no, we for the sake of human rights, for the sake of the world order, the US must continue to be in charge, then what they're really saying is the end result of that would be an open war with China, or possibility of confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, for example. Whereas I think that recognizing the reality of US power moving forward, what best serves American interests is to retrench, is to rethink our global empire, is to be willing to work with other countries, even if we disagree with them, which sort of gets to what I was saying at the opening, that even if we don't see eye to eye on everything, that doesn't mean we need to go to war with another country.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Although, listen, I'll take up the Dunroe Doctrine as a Canadian. I do have concerns about that. He's talking again about making Canada a 51st state. But let us move on now.
Right. Again,
Last,
I'm not in favor of that, but I think
okay.
maybe focusing on Latin America, would make sense. And I don't mean focusing our military power. I mean investing in a much stronger Western hemisphere, in making it such that we don't have populations in Central and South
Yeah,
America been driven by, poverty and violence to try to come to this country. If you're concerned about immigration, you should be trying to strengthen these countries.
yeah, yeah. Indeed, indeed. Now, just coming back to our opening conversation, last week on CNN, Robert Kagan, a neoconservative but no friend of Donald Trump, described the America that Trump has willed into being as, quote, an aggressive, imperialist, rogue superpower. Harsh words. Now, you are no neoconservative, Annelle, but would you agree with Robert Kagan?
I mean, I agree with his characterization of Trump, Trump's America as an aggressive imperialist rogue superpower, but I still fundamentally disagree with Robert Kagan, because he's one of these people who has long argued of the need for American hegemony, and he sees hegemony as sort of an example of consent, it's not coercion, because other countries agree to have the US as the leader, on the basis of these universal values. And that's nonsense. You think about the ways that any country that has been willing to stand up to the United States, be it North Korea or Iran or Cuba, that historically the U.S. has been sort of willing to tolerate. And now just the ways that Trump is, ousted the president of Venezuela, is bombing Iran. We might be about to bomb Cuba. We're starving babies in Cuba by cutting off all fuel supply. I mean, it is shocking that Americans have not been more up in arms about what Trump has been doing. And I think a lot of it is because people are afraid. They're afraid of ICE. They're afraid of authoritarianism. They are worried about what is going to happen in their own neighborhoods and less concerned necessarily about what's happening in these countries far away. But it's all part of this same deepening authoritarianism and aggression. And so while I agree with Kagan's characterization, I very much disagree with his idea that the US is somehow a benevolent hegemon when in fact American hegemony has been extremely violent and has only allowed us to get to this place where we have ICE agents roaming the street, locking up people regardless of their status. And not to say that they should be locked up if they're not citizens, but they're also locking up citizens.
Yeah.
I mean, it is very frightening, in terms of the midterms. I hope we have them. I hope American democracy survives, but it's not looking great, Bill.
Okay, and now look, one final thing, just that Kagan said that we've lost this war. Okay, has America lost this war? And if it has, how does it end for America, and I suppose for Donald Trump?
I mean, clearly, I think we have. Trump seems not eager to get back into an open shooting war, thank God. I suspect Trump may just walk away without a deal, and we may have some sort of de facto, companies that are willing to negotiate with Iran to get their ships through the Strait of Hormuz. We may just be left with this sort of de facto arrangement. Trump has also said that the U.S. isn't particularly affected by what happens through the Strait of Hormuz, which isn't true. Clearly, Americans are dealing with increase in prices, especially at the gas pump, but across the board. But we saw what happened when there was this effort. It seemed like maybe a deal was in the offing. You saw the Iran war hawks, you saw FDD, which is the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which was founded to improve sort of views of Israel in the United States. They're howling at the possibility of Trump actually reaching a deal. So I don't expect we are going to necessarily see successful negotiations here, even if Trump's team was actually capable of conducting them.
Yeah, that's the other question, of course, is that real estate guys and Trump's lawyer working on these incredibly complex, or not really working on this, but the nuclear deal, for example, very, very complex. Of course, Trump threw that all out, but here we are. Wow, dangerous times, Annelle. And as you say, the midterms, whoa. I think we here in the UK are hoping for a swift uppercut to Mr. Trump's jaw in the midterms. But whether it happens or not, whether he bobs and weaves out of it, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Well, and we'll have to see if they actually happen, as if they
Wow.
are conducted in a sort of what could be called a free and fair manner, I think is sort of unclear.
Wow, how quickly America's democracy is unraveling if that proves to be the case. But look, let us close for today and hope for better times. And I thank you very much for talking with me.
Thank you, Bill.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the Quincy Institute's Middle East analyst, Annelle Sheline. She was speaking to me from Washington, D.C. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. You'll have noticed we bring you the podcast with no sponsors and no advertising. It's the same for our daily newsletter. We are supported only by our subscribers. Like I said, Arab Digest is an independent voice. If you'd like to support that voice, head to our website, arabdigest.org. There you will find a team of experts, contributors like Annelle, covering developments in the Middle East and North Africa in depth and with insights you will not find anywhere else. follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.